Hello to all of those who are here at the minute. I think we were just leaving it another minute or so because we know there are a few people who are going to attend but aren't quite here yet. So if that's okay with everybody.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, I guess whoever's the secretariat can let people in as we go along. So I'd like to make a start. So welcome everyone and thank you for attending. During this meeting, it would be great if you could tweet your attendance and use the hashtag hashtag APPGONCP. You might have that in the email that you've had sent around, but anyway, that would be great. Super. And I just want to we've got a number of speakers today. 6 oh, it's in the chat there. It's just gone in the chat there, the hashtags. That would be great if you could tweet your attendance and anything else that you fancy tweeting about. That's exciting in this meeting. We've got 6 speakers, so we've got quite a bit to get through today. So we're going to hear from the speakers and then there will be a Q&A as well. And if I can ask people to put some questions in the chat, and that would be super. And if you don't get a chance to do that, you can raise your hand as well and we'll look out for them, myself and Paul Maynard. So just want to set a little bit of the scene about the progress that we've made since the last meeting. So this APPG's first report was published on the 24th of March. I put down an ADM to highlight the report, and we had a cross-party support from 30 parliamentarians, so that was great. And there's been written PQs from our vice chairs, Grace Smith and Dr. Lisa Cameron, to MP to confirm that the report had been discussed by NHS England, and I think we're still awaiting the outcome of that meeting. And I've passed the report to the opposition front bench, and I know Paul Maynard has written to the Minister of Care about it as well. So really the theme of today, every child has a fundamental right to access a decent education. It's something that will impact and influence their life chances for the better. Yet many children, especially those with cerebral palsy, can be excluded, whether intentionally or not, as they do not get the learning support that they need. So in this session, as part of the APPG's ongoing work, we're going to consider the impact of cerebral palsy as a lifelong condition, and we'll discuss education, health and care plans that were introduced under the Children and Families Act of 2014, and see what more can be done to enable children with cerebral palsy to get the support that they need in a school setting. I'm going to hand over to Paul now.
Thank you, Mary. Great to see everyone again. Nice to be here. I know we've only got 5 minutes for every speaker, so I ought to just take 5 seconds really, so I will do my best to. This is the second time round the block for Amanda and me on this issue, because we had our first parliamentary inquiry for this group back in 2014 on education and cerebral palsy. We had a Westminster Hall debate shortly after. We went to see the minister, and I'm sure just by me standing up in the chamber of the House of Commons, we had a revolutionary impact on education and cerebral palsy. I fear that might not have been the case. I'm sure something did improve, but we need to go around the block yet again. This battle for perfection never ends. Education and cerebral palsy, to me, isn't just about young people with cerebral palsy getting the same educational opportunities as everybody else. It's also about educating young people with cerebral palsy how to deal with their condition. And that doesn't just need to happen in school. It's a lifelong challenge almost. I stood in the gym with my personal trainer last Saturday, trying to work out why my buttocks would not do what my brain was telling them to do. So I tried to swing a kettlebell backwards and forwards. It took half an hour to get everything aligned in the right order. I know again, next week I will have the same challenge. And that's about educating myself, even now, to be patient, to concentrate, not to rush, and to let the brain try and do as much as it can. So if that's me at the age of 45 still struggling, imagine how much extra support many of our young people need if they are in mainstream education to survive and flourish and thrive in that environment. So today we were looking at the adequacy or otherwise of educational health and care plans. I got a long screen I could read out about what EHCPs are. I'm sure you all know far better than me. But I'm going to hand over to Amanda Richardson, who might want to say a few words as to what she thinks the key topics that we're going to be looking at today are. So I'll hand over to Amanda if she unmutes herself. Gentle hint.
Right. Okay. Right. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Speak up.
Okay. I speak up. And Paul, and yes, I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to join you and have this discussion today on EHCPs for children with cerebral palsy. I probably won't waste too much time talking about what an EHCP is. And suffice it to say that there have been several sort of iterations of the EHC process since Children and Families Act took place, and we are still very far, I believe, from actually having a fit for purpose service for so many children. And I just would like to say a few words to start this session off on why I feel that children with cerebral palsy are really a special case. We really feel that it is time that we talk about cerebral palsy as a very specific condition, because all too often the specific needs of children with CP are subsumed into a sort of a generic debate on special educational needs and disability, without really due consideration of the very real and specific barriers to learning and development that these children have as a result of their condition. And I just wondered if it might be helpful just to give a very brief sort of background really to what cerebral palsy is and the impact that has on children's learning and development. It is an umbrella term, cerebral palsy. It's an umbrella term for a group of motor disorders, which is fundamentally caused by damage to the developing brain before, during, or soon after birth. And we estimate there are about 30,000 children and young people in the UK with CP. And the condition is sometimes known as the cerebral palsy because there's so many different presentations of the condition. It is actually the most prevalent physical disability of childhood, and it affects those from all social backgrounds it is a lifelong condition in which the impact of the initial damage to the central nervous system will cause postural instability, contractures and deformities and other neurological impairments, which may have a severe impact on the individual opportunities and quality of life. And as we heard from Paul, it will not go away, and it is a lifelong job really to manage and maintain the mobility and the physical and medical well-being of individuals with CP. And it really does have an impact on a child's future opportunities and the quality of life. And that's really important, that children with CP have the very best early intervention and ongoing therapeutic, medical and expert professionals throughout their growing years and into childhood. So cerebral palsy primarily affects motor function, but it also encompasses a number of neurological disorders which will affect all aspects of cerebral palsy in the growing child, all aspects of development in the growing child. And so we really shouldn't just think of CP as a physical disability. It's a very unique neurological condition in which elements are interrelated and impact on each other in both subtle and complex ways. And this requires a global approach, bridging both health and education. And I know we will be hearing a bit more about this later on in this discussion and in the next one. So the way in which cerebral palsy will affect a child will be unique to that individual child, but they will probably experience the following: impaired transmission of information from the sensory systems, including touch, hearing, vision, taste, balance and coordination, which might lead to hypo or hypersensitivity or modulation problems. Retained primitive reflexes such as asymmetric tonic knee reflexes, Morrow and startle reflex. Abnormalities of tone, which is the most common sort of visual sign of CP, either being stiff or floppy, rigid, or maybe a fluctuation between these states. A child may have delayed or impaired writing and balance reactions. They may have short and long memory deficits and visual and spatial and navigational problems. And in terms of learning and their school career, these will impact on all aspects of cognition, language and communication difficulties, either as a result of low cognitive function or as a result of restricted access to the learning experiences of normally developing children. The structures of vision, hearing and speech and language and the processing of this information may be impaired. Speech and communication skills. Many children with cerebral will need alternative and augmentative systems of communication. Sensory and perceptual processing, which can lead to difficulties with motor planning and organisational skills. Health and well-being, sleep, eating and drinking, nutrition, digestion, respiration, epilepsy and other medical conditions. And last but not least, definitely not least, the emotional and social development and mental health of children and young people. And I list those not to sort of give you a lecture on cerebral palsy, but to really underline the complex issues that children and their parents deal with in ensuring that their education and their education plans really truly reflect the breadth of those needs. Just thinking about the education and health EHCPs, we really need to ensure that these plans truly reflect the detail, the level of the children's specific needs, the educational, therapeutic, medical and technical provision that are required to address these in each and every child, regardless of what type of school the child attends. This may be mainstream, special or specialist, local authority maintained or non-maintained, with the overall aim being to reduce barriers to the child learning and participation and to optimise their well-being and potential in their future life. The problem as I see it is that there's too often a lack of a joined up approach to teaching and therapeutic and medical intervention for children with cerebral palsy, which fails to recognise the interrelationship and interdependency of their physical and learning needs. And too often, each aspect of the child's needs is treated separately by professionals struggling with limited resources, lack of consistency and continuity. Schools too often have to teacher of a maintain have to health don't, and swimming current educational funding level. Bruce continues, the system has at its heart, and as it's too often, instead of the children's outcome. Bureaucracy is necessary, but it should lead first. Currently, this is letting CP down. Most are so many health and therapeutic disciplines to support them. There is too much variation of standards in this aspect across the country and for no apparent good purpose. We will continue to let these down as long as we see health input such as nursing, speech and language therapy and their education. It is their education, and it is pointless and spurious intellectual exercise to try to argue that communication or trunk control are any less a part of learning for a child's CP than to be literate and numerate. So this is why these APPG sessions, in my view, are need to seek a solution to how education, health and care services can be better funded and resourced, and so work together to deliver a cohesive and holistic support through their EHCPs, and thereby significantly improve the life chances of these vulnerable children. And I really look forward to hearing the evidence of so many professionals and stakeholders who have a wealth of experience in this field, and who I'm sure all share the aim of making lasting improvements for children with cerebral palsy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda. Now, I'm looking at Mike here. Is he going to nod to me to say Tulip is on? He is indeed going to nod. Fantastic. So it's going to be my turn to, I don't often do this, I'm going to introduce a Labour opposition spokesman. It's a good job I'm sitting down for the shock of it. Now, you might not know this, but actually, I really like opposition spokesmen, because the better they are, the better the minister has to be, because it puts them on notice. If they're not very good, they'll get found out pretty quickly. When I was a minister, I had really good opposition, and they really made me work that bit harder and try that bit harder. So I built up the expectations for Tulip. I'm sure she will meet them, give the government a hard time, and let's hear what you have to say. So over to Tulip Siddiq, the Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years. Come on in, your time is now.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks very much. And many thanks to you, to Mary, and to the APPG on cerebral palsy for organising this very important meeting and giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I'm going to rush off as soon as I've spoken. I hope that's okay. I've got a meeting with the Foreign Minister, speaking of Tory MPs, and I don't want to keep him waiting because I'll probably be in trouble if I do. But just to say, I am proud to be Labour's Shadow Minister for Children and Early Years. I'm the opposite number of Vicky Ford, who's the Minister responsible for special educational needs and disabilities, as well as being in charge of a range of issues. So my portfolio is quite broad in terms of early years, children's social care, free school meals, and a range of issues all relating to children and families. And I've done a lot of work on education, health and care plans as the Shadow Minister, but also as the MP for Hampstead and Kilburn, and before that as a councillor in Camden, because the deep systemic problems that they are with the way EHCPs are assessed and delivered puts children with SEND and their families through much difficulty, as I've personally seen. My husband was also a governor at Swiss Cottage Special School. Some of you may know that school, and we've done a lot of work with them. So it's a big part of my life and the job that I do. I've seen how far too many children with SEND simply can't get the support they need, or have to spend so long waiting and fighting for it that there's a substantial negative impact on their lives. And as you will know, for children with CP, this can often lead to isolation and really hamper their life chances, as well as the well-being of the whole family, as I've seen countless times through my casework, and many of you would have lived through it. And it's something that the previous speaker before me, Amanda, articulated so eloquently. It's the severe delays, the poor communications, and the lack of accountability are commonplace at present, and a recent local government ombudsman report into EHCPs found that the volume of complaints increased 45% between 2016 to 17 and 2018 to 19, and that nearly 90% of investigations into these were upheld. And for me, this indicates a systemic lack of compliance with the rules with those who are delivering this support. And I feel we have to do better. And it won't surprise you to know that the situation has worsened in the pandemic. At the height of this lockdown, just 16% of children with EHCPs were getting all the support set out in their EHCP, and 21% of parents said their children weren't getting any support set out in their plan, which is really dismal. And the relaxation in timescales for assessing EHCPs at the start of COVID-19 has increased the backlog of EHCP assessments. So what I want, and I'm sure everyone in this APPG wants, is for children with CP to be able to get quick assessments for their needs and for the provision that they become legally entitled to be delivered without parents being forced to spend every waking moment lobbying for it or threatening court action in some cases. There also must be much better support for those who are transitioning to adult support services, which are often, I find, inadequate or disconnected. The APPG has been doing fantastic work in making the case for joined up working across government departments and other bodies like NHS England and NICE to ensure there is proper surveillance of those at risk of CP, streamlined pathways of care, specific training for professionals engaging with families, early intervention, which is a particular area that I focus on a lot in my brief, uniform minimum standards across health authorities, and much more. However, I sincerely think we need fundamental change in how the EHCP system functions, and the upcoming SEN review is an opportunity to reform the system and upgrade the framework and resources that local authorities have to assess and deliver support to children with CP and others. I really hope, Paul, and I hope you'll join me in saying this, that I hope the government will take it and transform the lives of these children and families, because this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I hope we can work cross-party to challenge the government, but also to make sure that they do deliver on it. So as the Shadow Minister, I'll be scrutinising any attempt to downgrade the legal duties on SEN provision. And I'm of the firm belief that we need an upgrade of children's rights, not a downgrade. And I'll finish by saying that I will be alongside all of you fighting for a system that puts the needs of children with SEND first. And as Paul said, when it's necessary, I will be holding the government to account. And I'll be focusing a lot on the SEND review. And if anyone wants to email me, there's only one Tulip in Parliament, so you'll find me very easily. But do email me, because I am having regular meetings with Vicky Ford about making sure that the SEN review isn't just done and isn't just given lip service to. I want to make sure we actually capitalize on this opportunity to reform the system and to put children first. I hope that was challenging enough for you, Paul, but I will be holding the government to account, and I hope all of you will help me in doing that.
I look forward to sitting on the benches opposite, holding up scores like on Strictly Come Dancing, as to how challenging you're being. I really don't care who improves services, as long as they get improved. I don't care what party label we have. It's just important it happens. So really grateful for your contribution today. I know you have to dash off to see the foreign minister or whoever it is, Mr. Raab or whoever. So we'll let you go off and do that. And thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Paul. And I'm going to put my email address in the chat. So if there's something you'd like me to feed into with the SEND review or generally on my brief, then please do email me.
Can I, Tulip, thanks for that. There's a quick question. I don't know if you've got time to answer it, but somebody's asked. Yeah. Somebody's asked in the chat, do you think that there should be a cabinet level minister for children and young people to ensure cross-departmental issues like EHCPs are coordinated and championed appropriately? And that's from Ben Sutcliffe.
I mean, I think I wouldn't say it's a silver bullet. I would be in favour of obviously putting more attention onto children and young people services, because I do think sometimes we can lose sight of it in the overall education brief because schools take up so much time. I do think there is a lot of focus on children and young people. I mean, what I would say is I wouldn't want, this is the best way I can answer this after 20 years in politics, I wouldn't want there to be a cabinet level minister and then the government does nothing about it. I wouldn't want there to be just someone appointed and then nothing changes and there's no attention given to it. I would rather the work got done. I think that's a cop-out. I'm not answering it properly, but I'm just saying I wouldn't want someone to be appointed and then nothing gets reformed. Send review doesn't get the attention it deserves, and legal requirements get downgraded. I think it could stay as it is, but we'd have to spend more time on making sure that children's services are coordinated. And I do actually think, whether you're in opposition or in government, cross-departmental work does happen quite effectively, as long as you've got an effective minister. I think it does happen. I've seen it myself, and it does happen if you've got two effective ministers who are determined to get things done.
Thank you.
So unless Mary's got any further comments you want to have, I won't do a 10-minute diatribe on cross-departmental ministers, as I have very strong views on. We'll move on because we're running, because the time is short. The next speaker is Dr. Sarah Crombie, who is a clinical specialist and lead physiotherapist at Chailey Clinical Services, and also Sarah Gardner, who is a paediatric occupational therapist and advanced clinical practitioner, also at Chailey Clinical Services. I'm not sure which of you is going to be kicking it off, but one of you grab the mic, so to speak, and let's hear from you. So over to you. Thank you.
Hello. First of all, I have to apologise that my colleague actually is not coming, so you've just got me, I'm afraid. Are you changing the slides? Is that are you able to move to the next slide? Yeah. So I don't really just say that I'm a advanced clinical practitioner in paediatric neurodisability. So my background is from physiotherapy. So I'll be talking really from the therapy perspective on EHCPs. So I work at Chailey Clinical Services, which is a community-based tertiary level centre offering specialist rehabilitation and clinical care for children and young people with complex neurodisability, including cerebral palsy. And one of the services we look after is in managing therapy service into Chailey Heritage School, which is a non-maintained special school for children and young people with complex neurodisabilities. Next slide, please. I mean, firstly, I want to just talk about the importance of how an EHCP is written. It's really important who actually writes and contributes to the EHCP, because there's always a wide range of professionals who are involved in writing these, and it's their knowledge and experience and skill that really makes a difference as to what that child what's written into that child's EHCP in the end. So you may have we need to have professionals who not only have experience of working with children with cerebral palsy, but in different school settings, but also that they know how to write EHCPs. And because at the moment there's no sort of standardized training for professionals into writing EHCPs. And where I work, I mean, we have up to 10 different local authorities who would be inputting EHCPs with children to us, and you see the wide range of content and sort of quality of the EHCPs that come with the children. In terms of the sort of many strands that need to be brought together for the child in a meaningful way, this really often depends on the person who's actually putting the EHCP together. So therefore, this can be really quite variable for the child. For children with cerebral palsy, who have a physical disability, one of the really important things to think about for them is to identify very clearly their needs, including environmental needs. So what's the school, what kind of school environment do they need? What kind of specialist equipment do they need within that environment? What about the maintenance, the storage of that sort of equipment? What are the specialist skills and training that the school staff are going to need to not only manage the child therapy needs within that environment also, but all the equipment that they might need. And this often is not written very clearly in EHCPs. In terms of sort of format and language, you know, we know that EHCPs are a legal document. They need to be very clear, very precise. But actually one of the difficulties with that when you're coming to the implementation of EHCPs is actually the flexibility, in that if you have to be so specific in writing down what it, you know, how much a child needs on a weekly basis, for instance, then you're not able to be as flexible when a child needs, when they have a very changing health need, or if they require surgery, for instance, or there's some equipment difficulties they have, then the therapy teams are not able to be flexible to be able to meet that need. Have the next slide, please. In terms of how an EHCP is interpreted and then implemented by the school itself, this can be really variable depending on the school that child attends, on their particular experience, what kind of knowledge they have, what are the school's attitudes towards not only disability, but to the level of risk that a child with cerebral palsy can take. And all these different variables can impact on that child learning and on their development in all aspects of their development, including physical development, and the ability for that child to be able to join in and participate in that particular child's context. Because one of the issues with the EHCPs is they're written without knowing what that school context is. And then it's about how then that school interprets what's written down on paper into that school context. So, for instance, you might have, you know, one school who sees a child's health EHCP, the therapy perspectives of that, in a very much a health need, and so therefore they might have a specific teaching assistant who might look after. It may be very siloed into a part of the school system, rather than seeing that that aspect of the child's needs as part of their whole school curriculum. And so therefore they may be treated, those health needs may be treated very differently depending on which school that child attends. So just giving you an example, for instance, you might have very specifically in a EHCP might be written that a child needs to stand in a standing frame for 30 minutes 3 times a week. That wouldn't be an unusual aspect of a child with cerebral palsy in their EHCP. You know, one school might take that you know, that child may be withdrawn from class perhaps to do that activity. It may be when the teaching assistant is free, or whenever it fits in with the whatever the class is doing, that child can do that activity. Or another school might look at the child's that need in light of their whole of their curriculum, to see actually when could that child stand when the rest of the class perhaps is standing for doing another activity where the other children might be standing. So that child then doesn't miss out on activities that the other children would be doing. So, sorry, next slide, please. So in terms of sort of, you know, best practice examples, I mean, when a therapy is integrated into a child's curriculum or their school day, so we think about that child and what's the best thing for that child in their school day, and that it's not seen as a very separate health-related only activity for that child. Secondly, where that therapy is viewed within that child's week, it's really important that how it impacts on that child. That child doesn't miss out always on the same lessons they're taken out for doing a particular activity. And actually that child's views are really very much paramount to what to how their therapy is delivered within that school context. And going back to individual circumstances, that actually children's needs fluctuate, and sometimes EHCPs are actually unnecessarily rigid, which means that it's very difficult then to translate that into a school context. It's important that the team working around the child are very cohesive. So not only the team within the school, so that actually everyone working with the child knows about that child's EHCP, what are their aspirations, what are the child and family aspirations, what are their goals. It's not just the one person who perhaps is working with that child, but also the team around the professional team. So you don't have, a physiotherapist coming in one day, an occupational therapist coming in another day, and then not really them talking together about that child's experience within the school. And so therapy really is everybody's responsibility. It isn't just the one person in the school who's given the EHCP to deliver for that child, but everybody who is interacting with that child, from the teacher to the dinner lady, is really important. Okay, just to finish off then, it's really important with staff training that that therapy staff regularly support them and then review any delegated activities in terms of any programs and equipment. Thank you very much. Sorry if I've overrun a bit.
Okay, thank you. There's no indications of anyone asking any questions in the chat, so I think we should move on. That was very, very useful, Sarah. But if we move on to the next speaker, because we've got quite a few to get through. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Helen Hunt, who is a trustee of Action Cerebral Palsy and the parent of Wilf, who has cerebral palsy. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you. So my son Wilf, just to give you a little bit of context, was born 3 months premature with meningitis and had a prolonged stay in the neonatal intensive care unit, leaving hospital 8 weeks later. At 16 months of age, he was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. Before I talk about the EHCP process, it needs to be said that one of the main problems for CP children is their educational provision is very much determined not by their unique physical health and educational needs, but simply by what is available to the local authority. And often there is only one special needs school for your child to attend. If there is no early years provision in your area that specialises in cerebral palsy, such as the School for Parents that exist at places like Pace, the Rainbow Centre, Infield Manor School, to name a few, you're at the mercy of the health professionals in your area to point you in that direction of specialist schools that can cater for the needs of CP children. But they are told not to recommend other places that specialise in CP that could help, and this is where one of the problems exists. For Wilf, all the processes and assessments of need were geared towards the predetermined outcome that he would attend our local special school. There was no other option presented or even considered. My experience in my local authority, which is Dorset, is that the schools where most cerebral palsy children are likely to attend are also the default schools for those children with the most severe ASD and the most challenging behaviour. Unfortunately, combining these two very different sets of pupils does not work particularly well. Cerebral palsy children lack the mobility of many of their peers, whose behaviours can seem unpredictable, loud, and often frightening. A cerebral palsy child's very particular sensory motor needs are difficult to support and regulate in this type of environment. For Wilf, it was obvious he merited assessment for an education healthcare plan. In addition to quadriplegic cerebral palsy, he cannot stand independently, cannot talk. He is globally delayed and has a severe learning difficulty. As part of the EHCP process, the local authority's educational psychologist, upon meeting Wilf for the first time and only time, observed him from afar for about 10 minutes and then proclaimed that she knew Wilf's type. being naively confident in the workings of a system I had yet to comprehend. I assumed the person guiding this process really did know my son and the ideal provision for his needs. But I was wrong. There was in fact no understanding of Wilf's specific needs as a cerebral palsy child, nor how it was vital that education and health provisions would need to be combined in order to help him learn and progress. The assessments provided by physio and occupational therapy showed they too had not fully grasped his needs, and the suggested provision and input from therapy services was loose, non-committal, and generally lacking. They knew the only school available to Wilf was our local special needs school, and they assumed his needs would be met there and that they could reduce their own provision for Wilf on the assumption it would be met by the school, when in fact the school was unable to make such commitment simply because it did not have the resources. As Wilf went through his first year at our local special school, it became clear he was making very little progress, if any at all. It was only at this point that the failings of the EHCP assessment process became horribly apparent. Wilf's EHCP was not only months late in arriving, but it had been shoddily put together by a SEND team who had little idea about the needs of cerebral palsy children and was most likely trying to make sense of what to write in it with the vague assessments provided to them by professionals. The EHCP was barely worth the paper it was written on. It was non-specific, woolly and non-committal enough to be able to give the local authority all the wriggle room it needed with regard to claiming it was meeting its statutory obligations to meet Wilf's educational needs. However, in my fight to have an EHCP with any value at all, this document has now ended up being long and very prescriptive to ensure Wilf's needs are detailed accurately and that he accesses appropriate provision. With regard to cerebral palsy children, the EHCP itself is structurally flawed. It splits health and therapies from education. And while that may make sense in order to make clear who is responsible for what and what the expectations are, it makes describing input and collaborative working between health and education professionals impossible to describe when for a CP child, therapy input is an integral part of educational need. I quickly picked up on there being a conflict of interest in the local authority, allowing NHS children's therapy teams to contribute to EHCP assessments when budgetary and other departmental constraints informs the level of service the health authority is able to provide to the service, provide to the school before full consideration of the needs of the child. The same conflict of interest exists when the local education authority asks its own educational psychologists to assess the provision that the local education authority should provide a child. Here in Dorset, it became apparent very quickly that very few professionals had a grasp of what specialist provision for cerebral palsy children actually looked like. For example, the professionals at the local authority and our designated clinical officer had no idea what conductive education was, and yet they were the ones who would advise and make recommendations about suitable provision for my son and children like him. It became an exercise in myself and Wilf's dad educating the professionals around us. Given that resources are so tight, this means both health and education authorities are by default incentivized to be unambitious for every child. This goes against the SEND code of practice. Wilf was being failed by an education provision that was too generic in its approach and lacked the specialisation for cerebral palsy and the essential integration of health and education. At the heart of this is a broken, compartmentalised system that is not functioning as a whole to address the holistic needs of cerebral palsy children. We're not talking about a rare condition here. We're talking about the most common childhood disability. I now live part-time in a caravan on a campsite so that Wilf can attend a specialist cerebral palsy school 120 miles away from home. Despite being a qualified doctor, my career has suffered, but I feel it is worth it to see Wilf finally progress and develop and really enjoy life. The one positive experience I can draw upon within the EHCP process was when Wilf's head of early years at his current school took on the task to improve his EHCP, almost rewriting it with the support of therapists who understood Wilf's needs, forming it into a plan that makes a great deal more of sense. It's now very prescriptive in order to protect Wilf's access to appropriate and effective provision. It is only when you have professionals like this supporting your child that your child's voice can be truly heard through this process. Even with an EHCP that details need accurately and makes clear what provision is required, and when the results are evident in the mountains of progress, for example, my son is finally making at his new school, it is still not enough for our local authority to allow Wilf to remain settled in his school. And they have only made a commitment to funding for 1 more year while they explore appropriate provision within our locality, even though it does not exist. And that was even after the support from our designated clinical officer, Wilf's NHS physiotherapist, his previous head teacher at his old school, and his paediatrician. His progress was acknowledged by all, and that they would not be able to provide the input he currently has in order to meet need. And some also made clear that Wilf may risk losing some of his new skills if he were to return to local provision. This means we have to make a renewed case every year, which is a hugely daunting task and time-consuming effort. I am therefore left in limbo regarding what plans I can and cannot make, both for my family and for my career. The key changes I would like to see are the following. The EHCP assessment process needs to be more independent. In effect, the LA and health authorities are marking their own homework by having their own ed psychs and therapists provide both assessment of need and recommendations for provision that their departments provide. Secondly, it is of paramount importance that assessments are provided by specialists in cerebral palsy who have experience of the range of schools and services available for children with CP. And lastly, robust independent support for parents during this process. This is a legally binding document, and legal support and advocacy should be provided to parents, as unfortunately, a lot of my time is taking up needing to go into battle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that contribution. I thought a very powerful contribution. I know many of us thought that EHCPs were the magic wand that was going to make everything all right, and that after decades of parents struggling to fight their way through the system, suddenly we would have a piece of paper that would open the doors, that councils would know now precisely what was needed. It simply hasn't delivered on the original promise at all. Not for want of trying on the part of so very many people, but we clearly now need this review, need to understand what improvements are needed, not just I think in the EHCP process itself, but in what is expected from local councils. This postcode lottery that some places get it right, some places get it wrong, and we see in your case that it really seems to have gone horribly wrong. You shouldn't have to be going through what you are going through. So thank you for sharing what I think is a very, very powerful experience, and we wish you and Wilf all the best for the future, and hope that things improve over time. But you know, very illustrative story. So I think it is now my turn to now introduce the next one as we try and move through. We are slightly behind time, as you might have noticed, but onwards and upwards. The next speaker is Lucy Atherton, who is a senior SEN lawyer. It may help watchers to learn that for 12 weeks, I was a justice minister who was in charge of tribunals. And I saw the lengthy wait, the growing lengthy wait at SEN tribunals, and held my head in horror. Luckily, I got reshuffled before I could have any chance to go and shout at DFE about it. So they got away with it. But I know exactly what Lucy is probably going to say about the inadequacy of the tribunal system. So Lucy, over to you if you're out there and are unmuted.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm here on behalf of IPSEA, which is a national charity that offers free and independent, legally based advice, information and support to help get the right education for children and young people with all types of special educational needs and disabilities, or SEND. We've supported nearly 5,000 families through our helpline and tribunal support service over the past year. And I also checked our database, which goes back about 10 years, and we've supported nearly 900 children and young people with cerebral palsy. I know I only have a few minutes, so I'll give a top-level background of EHC plans and how the SEND tribunal system is currently working in relation to disputes. And then I'll briefly outline 6 key policy requirements to ensure that children and young people living with cerebral palsy are provided the support they're legally entitled to. The first three of these recommendations are specific and the latter three are more overarching policy needs. So education, health and care plans, or EHC plans, are required where a child or young person needs more support than a mainstream setting could provide out of their own resources, whether that's in a special school or in a mainstream school. For children and young people with cerebral palsy, an EHC plan is likely to be necessary in order to access things like regular therapies, such as physiotherapy, as Sarah outlined earlier. Families sometimes need to challenge local authorities' decision-making in order to get the support to which the child or young person is legally entitled, as we just heard in detail from Helen. Typically, this is because their local authority seems more focused on gatekeeping resources than on providing the support that the child needs, regardless of what the law says. IPSEA provides advice to families in this situation. These types of challenges are heard by the SEND Tribunal, which is a specialist tribunal. It's free to use and it's independent of local authorities. The SEND Tribunal can only apply the law, so it's inaccurate really to talk about parents winning or losing, because all the tribunal is doing is determining whether or not the child or young person is legally entitled to the support requested. Despite this, 95% of appeals result in a decision partly or wholly in favour of the parent, which is an extremely telling statistic. In many cases, local authorities rely on parents or young people being unwilling to challenge their decisions. Separately, as Tulip mentioned, in complaints brought to the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, 87% of complaints about EHC plans were upheld, and the local area SEND inspection programme has found that more than half of local areas inspected by Ofsted and the Care Quality Commission have significant weaknesses when it comes to identifying and meeting children's needs. So all of these statistics illustrate the frequently poor quality of local authorities' decision-making processes. Everyone understands that budgets are tight. However, an approach that's driven by waiting for and then responding to crises can end up costing more than addressing a child's needs at an earlier stage, with incalculable costs for young people and their families. No matter how tight budgets are, local authorities still need to be held to account for how they're discharging their legal duties to the families who depend upon them. So that background serves to illustrate the current landscape, and now I'll briefly run through the 6 policy changes that the evidence strongly suggests need to be made. Children and young people with cerebral palsy require joined up approaches between education, health and social care, as their needs are likely to span these 3 areas. The Children and Families Act and the accompanying regulations are very clear about local authorities' duties to children who need multi-agency support. There's a trial period currently running in which the SEND Tribunal is able to make recommendations on health and social care as well as education. The first policy change we want to see is for appeals to be allowed on health and social care matters on a permanent basis. The second policy change, which relates to the first, is that tribunal powers on health and social care should be strengthened so that binding orders can be made, not simply recommendations, as is currently the case. The COVID-19 pandemic and the measures to address it downgraded legal duties under emergency legislation, and that sent a message that support for children with conditions such as cerebral palsy is not crucial and can be deprioritised. The effects of this are likely to be long-lasting, and as such, the third specific policy change that IPSEA is calling for is the restoration of all support and special educational provision withdrawn from children during the COVID-19 pandemic. And now to the 3 overarching policy needs. The government's ongoing and long-awaited SEND review is an important opportunity to address the problems with the way the SEND legal framework is working in practice, not least the gap between local authorities' duties to children and the resources available. However, the widespread culture of disregarding the law on SEND also needs to change. This is a question of leadership and priorities as well as resources. In this context, the 3 overarching policy needs that IPSEA is calling for are, firstly, no dilution of existing rights and entitlements when the SEND review concludes. Secondly, sufficient funding to ensure that all children and young people with SEND receive the support required to meet their individual needs, whether that's under SEN support or through an EHC plan. And finally, the introduction of a robust accountability framework to identify when local authorities are not meeting their statutory duties, with serious consequences for unlawful decision making. I'll keep it short, so I'll finish there. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that, Lucy. Yeah, there's six points and the 3 overarching ones, which I'm sure we can help present. And I'm sure Paul Maynard might have a word with the Minister about those ones. So thank you very much for that.
It could be a very long meeting. We might have to go away for the weekend together.
Okay, sorry. And I don't think there's anything in the chat there. No, there's not. So thank you for that, Lucy. I know from my experience as well, from my daughter, the issue of having health and education and social care and the big fight about who was going to pay for which pieces of equipment and just delayed everything. And yeah, that certainly needs a joined up approach and to be much more consistent. I want to, so thanks again for that, Lucy. I want to now introduce our final speaker, and that's Claire Smart, who is the Director of Education at the PACE Centre. So straight over to you, Claire.
Great, thank you. As Amanda outlined earlier this afternoon, my experience is that sadly, despite its prevalence as a lifelong condition affecting approximately 1 in 400 children and young people, there still seems to be a common misconception across the whole education sector that cerebral palsy is a purely physical disability or motor impairment. And to the untrained eye, it's easy to overlook the fact that a child or young person with CP puts information together very differently to their neurotypical peers. The quality of the information will be different, and the structure within the central nervous system which processes that information may be damaged or not available. And so the processing of this information will be slower. So it's really important for all of the professionals involved to have that adequate training, to recognise that the central nervous system is not just about movement, but also that sensory processing. And the sensory difficulties associated with CP, as I think most of the people gathered today are aware, can be just as challenging as their motor impairment itself. So I was reflecting on the SEND code of practice from my experience, both previously in a mainstream environment and now in a very specialist environment. And it's obviously these reforms that brought together the education, health and care plans, which should in principle be ideally placed, as someone said earlier, this magic wand to help meet the educational and therapeutic needs of a child with CP. However, similar to some of the issues that both Sarah and Helen highlighted so well earlier on, this system can only ever truly meet the needs of these children if the professionals conducting the assessments are trained to an appropriate level in relation to cerebral palsy, and if they are truly independent and unbiased, which does not sadly always appear to be the case from our experience, and clearly that's been the experience of others here to date as well. The EHCP document is the pivotal gateway for a child or young person with CP to access appropriate support and specialist provision. And it's really imperative that it's written by these unbiased professionals with an expert knowledge of cerebral palsy to ensure appropriate school placement and high quality provision. So a key strength of this reformed EHCP system in theory is that it was highly child-centred. Following the expert assessment of need, outcomes are supposed to be set in order to then inform the provision required to meet those outcomes, which in turn should then be used to inform the most appropriate placement for the student, which is why the school placement is not named on the proposed amended EHCP. And I must confess that I really did feel quite emotional listening to Helen's first-hand experience of that process not being executed as it should be, with the child and family at the heart of the process. And from my experience at PACE, this experience is sadly all too common for parents with a child who has cerebral palsy. So as a head teacher of an independent special school working with multiple local education authorities, my experience is also that there are vast differences in the way that EHCPs are written and the quality and robustness of these. And they vary not only from one LEA to another, but even within the SEND team, depending on the specific SEND officer or EHCP coordinator involved. I've experienced, and it may not be avoidable, but staff shortages leading in temporary SEN officers being drafted in who simply haven't got the training or experience or knowledge to step in and pick up a case as that child and family need them to, for example. So that lack of training and awareness about cerebral palsy can result in the EHCP being written in a way that's really not a true reflection of the child's needs. And from my experience, it's not uncommon for expert clinical assessments and recommendations to be simply disregarded or excluded. The SEN officer or EHCP coordinator writing the EHCP, which, you know, ultimately seems to choose at times to omit recommendations and clinical assessments informed advice. And that can result in a family having to challenge the LEA to get these recommendations included and ultimately go through to an appeal, which, you know, is traumatic and upsetting for the family and also very, very expensive, as Helen highlighted earlier on. So also, like Lucy said in her presentation, since a child with cerebral palsy will invariably have a wide range of different needs and priorities spanning all areas of learning, these simply don't fit neatly into the education, health and care sections of the EHCP. Education and therapy often seem to get separated and considered in isolation, completely disregarding the fact that children with cerebral palsy are much more cognitively able quite often than their bodies are able to show. To give a real example, there's a young person we're working with at PACE at the moment for whom their EHCP is not at all reflective of their needs because their therapeutic provision is listed entirely separately in section G in health, separate to education in section E, suggesting that this therapy is not a need, a prerequisite in order to access that education, and they sit separately, which simply isn't the case. And what we know about the central nervous system simply tells us that isn't true. So in my view, children with cerebral palsy are entitled to the provision which meets their complex and very specific sensory, physical and learning needs. The curriculum needs to span way beyond academic learning to include sensory processing and regulation, communication, play, motor control and activities of daily living. All of those areas of learning which for a neurotypical able-bodied child happen quite naturally and organically as they meet their motor milestones. But those early learning skills, that motor control, the play, the interaction, that is part of an appropriate integrated curriculum for a child or young person with cerebral palsy. It is not simply a bolt-on for a child or young person to be removed from a literacy lesson for their therapy and then to return. So to deliver this curriculum, this requires a combined clinical and educational expertise of a multidisciplinary team, which I know has already been highlighted this afternoon, to fully address these broad and complex needs, which go far beyond the physical disability visible from the outside. And like I said, these curriculum areas must be woven into all aspects of the school day, as opposed to being a therapy bolted on to a one-size-fits-all academic curriculum. So the risks of not accessing an inclusive and appropriate curriculum of this nature, from my experience, include being underestimated in terms of their abilities, both physical and cognitive, becoming disengaged from their learning if their sensory needs are not well understood and catered for, and becoming passive both in their attention and in their physical activity, which could increase the risk of muscular atrophy and contractures over time. So to avoid these risks becoming a reality, families who have a child with cerebral palsy, sadly, must summon up the strength and resources to battle within a system where their child's needs are seemingly underestimated and misunderstood. A struggle they must endure on top of the grief and trauma that they may already be experiencing as a family trying to cope with the demands of caring for a child with a complex neurodisability. So for this reason here at PACE, we spend a lot of time investing in our relationship and communication with the LEA SEND teams, whilst also supporting families in navigating a system which appears to repeatedly test and challenge them, as opposed to placing them at the heart of the process, which the SEND reforms promised. We will continue to offer SEND officers within our LEAs the opportunity to attend PACE training on cerebral palsy free of charge. We will continue to deliver training and outreach support to schools, and we're developing an online digital platform which will offer support and training to families and professionals with regards to cerebral palsy. So obviously PACE will continue to play our part and fulfil our vision that every child in the UK with a sensory motor disorder and their family can access education and support services aligned with our PACE model and ethos, as I've outlined to you today. But there's so much more that needs to be done. So to summarise, there are three key priorities which in my view require urgent national reform for the benefit of children in the UK who have cerebral palsy and their families. These are increased awareness and expertise about this complex condition to inform EHCPs, which should absolutely be written using recommendations made by skilled and expert, unbiased, independent professionals. Secondly, adequate funding for LEA SEND teams to support appropriate placements for children with cerebral palsy. And thirdly, universal access to appropriate and integrated curriculum provision delivered by multidisciplinary teams for children with cerebral palsy. So to finish, together, I think it's our shared responsibility to ensure the quality and appropriateness of EHCPs and the resulting provision so that these young people can reach their full potential and take their place in the world alongside their neurotypical peers. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Claire. And I get some of the asks that you've laid out there were similar to the previous ask, especially having that clinical expertise involved in writing these the EHCPs. It's now we're opening up for a little bit of discussion. I know we're a little bit behind time, but if there are people who want to ask any questions or give suggestions, that's great. I'm just looking at the chat box, and Amanda, do you want to come in with your question? Amanda Richardson.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I just feel that this theme of expertise has come up so often in these discussions, and I'm really hanging on to the comments that have been made just by Claire and by the other speakers around, you know, the really deep understanding of cerebral palsy, but not just of cerebral palsy as a condition, but of the very specific needs of individual children. For example, when an educational psychologist or a therapist or whoever is undertaking that initial assessment, that child deserves to be assessed by somebody who really truly understands how they communicate, the impact of that assessment experience on the child's sensory system, on the behaviour. It's so easy to get a very false picture of that child's abilities if that assessment is not done incredibly sensitively and incredibly well. I'm just concerned, I suppose, about firstly the validity of some of the assessments that go towards the education, health and care plans, but also really how do those individuals, and how can we ensure that they do actually have that depth of knowledge to adequately perform their task and their job? Because they only get one chance to do that, and it is often because of the poor quality of those assessments that parents have to resort to appeal to actually then, if they can afford it, and again we're looking at, often families that have the resources to go to appeal, to get independent assessments done by experts. And so the whole process is just made a nonsense because of that initial lack of expertise in the assessment process. That's my point. But the question is, and I think it go back to some policy reform that's needed, is about the competencies of those responsible for carrying out assessments and creating EHCPs for children with cerebral palsy. I don't know if anybody else has got any experience of that themselves.
Stick your hand up if you have, or if you wish to share a response to Amanda's diagnosis. It is a diagnosis, a very pertinent one.
Oh, there's a hand up there. Is it Joanne?
Yeah, it's Sue Dorrington. That's my son's name.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, I totally agree with Amanda that in a sense, what we need is specialist clinics. I think that have a multidisciplinary team of people qualified to holistically assess CP, that is perhaps a nationally accredited clinic where, because time and time again, as Amanda's pointed out, parents face scanty LAEP assessments, where sort of cognitive assessments are cherry picked because of time limitations. So dissatisfied and you know, wealthier parents will then seek an independent assessment, and more often than not, LAs will say, well, you know, we don't take account of independent assessments, and certainly schools say that to parents. And this all adds to delays and confusion and stress. And the other point I wanted to make was about the action of an EHCNA. Obviously, the legal test criteria to action an education, health and care needs assessment is that the young person or child may have additional needs and may need provision through an education, health and care plan. And what we find is often there are delays because education settings haven't done the evidencing of what support they've put in place and what the impact of that support has. So those EHCNAs get gated at the first hurdle or blocked at the first hurdle. And so the family have failed because the schools haven't done the evidencing for the LA to take that EHCNA on. And that causes infinite delays, which obviously impact negatively on any child, let alone a child with cerebral palsy.
Yes, thank you for that. And there's a couple of comments in the chat box that I would agree with you around the fact that it's those parents, often the way the system works is that it's the parents who have the capacity to navigate the system, who end up with the pushing for the best provision for their children, and conversely the families who may not have the time or the experience or whatever that end up with the lesser provision. I mean, I just know from my experience that I thought I could navigate the system and thought I had a little bit of something about, I was a counsellor to begin with, and even I didn't know how to navigate the system or what to ask for. I think the issues with the parent is, if you don't know what's on offer, how on earth do you then ask for something that may help your child if you don't know what's out there to begin with? So you do need that expert and the clinicians to suggest some of the things that would help your child. The same with the school. I had one school that my daughter could go to, so how can you compare whether that's a good school or not if there isn't another school around? I know that's a separate issue, but I think there is something about having the experts involved massively, just for peace of mind for the families as well, that it is the best clinicians and the best experts out there that are making these decisions on your child's behalf. Do we have anyone else in the chat? I think it's comments mainly. Yeah.
I think
anyone
got say a few words. I just think it's a really interesting dilemma for policymakers. This issue about different parents having a different ability to navigate the system. I obviously see that in my constituency as much as Mary. And do we as policymakers try to create a system where no one needs to have to navigate the system because it's so great, it works fantastically anyway? Or do we need to create a system whereby those who are struggling to navigate the system get much more assistance to do so? I'm not sure policymakers have the bandwidth to do most. So reaching for the perfect system that might take a bit longer, do we then sacrifice the opportunity to help those who are struggling to navigate the system? I find that a hard one to get my mind around. What should I focus on first? And a lady whose name isn't Joran has her hand up.
Yes, I mean, and support of what Helen said. I mean, key to equality is families being able to self-advocate and also advocate equally, independent of their sort of particular background. And what I would like to bring out is that time and time again amongst our families, we hear SENDIAS services across the country are really struggling to provide that support for families. And obviously they're free at source for all families. you know, this is becoming increasingly a national problem, and I think that needs to be taken to central government, that, you know, SENDIAS services, which are a statutory provision, are really struggling to provide the support that families need. So, you know, families, you know, from a sort of lower socioeconomic group are going to struggle more because they can't access independent advocacy or private advocacy.
Thank you. We have Helen's got her hand up.
Yeah, it was just to say that I raised this issue in the initial speech that I made at the parliamentary report by Action CP that was presented, the Freedom of Information report. Forgive me, Amanda, I cannot remember the name of it. And it was making the point that myself, being a doctor, being an educated woman, Wilf's dad is a journalist, and you know, together we have a very strong strong voice for Wilf. But that is, you know, that is a combined voice that offers such strength. There are lots of families that are either they wouldn't know how to navigate the system. I mean, even with my experience and knowledge and skills, it's taken me a long time to know how to navigate this system. But also parents are exhausted. We are absolutely exhausted with caring for children. Wilf is perhaps a little more mobile than a number of cerebral palsy children, but there are so many care needs that we have to cover. And then you also look at our access to social care and respite, which is a whole other topic that, you know, we haven't really explored. And so for that reason, it becomes an absolute battle, and you can't rely on, most of the time, professionals to have the right expertise and the right experience to do that fighting and that navigating for you. So it was really just to make that point that whilst, you know, I'm in that lucky position, I suppose, and Wilf's in that fortunate position that me and his dad have that strong voice for him. And other parents would love to have that voice, but also it comes down to purely being absolutely exhausted as well. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of time to navigate this system.
Thanks for that, Helen. I totally agree with that. Sue's hand, is that an historical hand or a new hand?
No,
are you
sorry.
on mute, Sue?
Working out how to put it down.
Oh, yeah. No, no, it is my hands up. Yeah, I just wanted to just raise a point that I know Sarah Crombie talked about, integration of therapy into the whole day curriculum, which I think works very well, you know, in certain contexts and in certain settings. You know, I think that is the way, certainly in early years and primary, that, you know, it needs to be done, and certainly in a special school setting. I think from my own personal experience, I have a young man with CP who's 23 now. In the mainstream setting, that, you know, it was very difficult to integrate therapy into the whole day curriculum, and therapy did become a sort of standalone session outside of the main curriculum for him. And I just wanted to raise the point that you know, it's all about, you know, bringing the child into the centre of the decision making, because he would have been mortified to be in a standing frame in a class of peers. So it had to be done as a standalone in a private room. So just you know, I suppose what I'm trying to emphasise is bring the voice of the child into this, and take account of the context and the setting. And there's a no one size fits all approach to meeting the needs of these young people. That said, my son had all the early intensive therapy input integrated into the whole day curriculum. And what has been notable through our journey is because the importance of therapy input was very much conditioned, if you like, into his whole day curriculum. he's continued to be very, very compliant with his therapy throughout his journey into adulthood, because of that early intensive therapy input and integration into the whole day curriculum. He has taken real responsibility and accountability to carry that integration through his life. And I think that's very, very important to note that, but also to contextualize it and listen to the voice of the child and take account of the context and the setting that the child's being educated in, and find a fit that sort of fits with the child too.
Thank you for that, Sue. I was just reading comments in the chat there as well while you were talking. Do we have anyone else who wants to say anything, have an input? If not, I think, well, Paul, first of all, from my point of view, this has been a really, really useful session, and I know that, that all of the information we have today will be added to the report that the APPG will be producing. There will be a report on the 3rd and 4th APPG meeting, and that's in October, and there's still a call for evidence for submissions, and that call for evidence closes on the 30th of July. So if you have anything that you do want recording or highlighting in that report, please email the APPG with that information. I don't know whether, Paul, you have anything else to say, or I just want to thank everybody, obviously, for attending. It's been very useful. Thanks to the speakers, thanks to everybody here, and obviously to the Secretariat who put this together. Paul, I
very much echo all of Mary's thanks and so on and so forth. Really interesting contributions, particularly around the legal aspects that I haven't really thought about before. So that's given me a whole new angle to attack this from. So I look forward to seeing, I think Amanda's asked for some notes on that. So maybe when I get that, another reason to go and haunt Vicky Ford in her sleep, maybe. So much to go at her on. She's going to be sick of the sight of me, I'm sure. So thank you all very much indeed. I'm going to head off now because I've got a 3:30 appointment, but thank you all for joining, and I hope to see you at the next one. So thanks a lot. Bye bye now.